Depending on who you ask, Maxx is either the saviour of Yu-Gi-Oh! Or a scourge that ruins the game. There's plenty of YouTube videos already discussing why Maxx is bad, so instead I will be looking at the card from a different angle, by attempting to quantify how good Maxx is exactly. Now, it's impossible to know precisely how many games Maxx wins on its own, but in this video I will attempt to find an approximate percentage for how often the games are decided purely because of the card. I will do this by looking at three things. Firstly, how likely it is that someone will draw Maxx in their opening hand. Secondly, how likely it is that the player getting Maxx will have a counter. And finally, how a player's win rate changes when they use Maxx. Using the data provided on card usage rate by the Master Duel developers, in the last month of the game, February 2024, 94.4% of players in the highest rank had Maxx in their deck. Now, whether the highest rank means Master 1 or the whole of Master in general, who knows. This information gives us some insight into how a player's deck might look on the ladder, although it might only be representative of the higher ranks. You can calculate the chance that players in a random ranked duel have Maxx from this usage rate by taking that 94.4% and using it for these calculations. Using this information, almost 90% of the time, both players in the match will be playing Maxx, there being only a measly 0.31% chance that neither player has it in the deck. Looking at this as a bar chart puts into perspective how small the chance of no one having Maxx is. The usage data can also be used to look at some of the popular Maxx counters. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, Call by the Grave, and Crossout Designator form what is commonly known as the Maxx tags in someone's deck. The popularity of this can be seen with Ash Blossom being almost as ubiquitous as Maxx is, being played in 92% of decks, and with Call by and Crossout being used in the majority of decks at 71.7% and 58.9% play rates respectively. While these cards can always be used to counter Maxx, there are two other commonly played cards that can be used to stop it in Droll and Lockbird and Cypher and Gamma, which I will include here. They are played in 56.7% and 15.9% of decks respectively. Here's the usage rate as a bar chart to make it easier to visualise. Unfortunately, just knowing what percent of players play certain cards is not enough to know the chance of players drawing that card, because you need to know how many copies of the card each player runs. Luckily for me though, there is a site that holds a large database of high-level Master Duel decks that I can use to work out this information in Master Duel Meta. Looking at decks for the last month on the site, I found 1,245 submitted decks, but 251 were during the Synchro X Link Festival, which had Maxx banned, so they can't be used here, leaving me with 994 decks to look at. Looking at the data of the 994 decks, 929 of them contain Maxx. For the Maxx counters, they range from 882 for Ash Blossom, to 504 for Crossout, to 133 for Gamma. Maxx was played in 929 out of the 994 decks, which is a 93.46% play rate, a pretty close number to the data from Master Duel itself. Looking at the Maxx counters, the percentages for those, well, definitely not exactly the same, close enough to where I would say these decks are a good representation of the overall Master Duel ladder, despite issues like some of these decks being from tournaments, meaning they will probably have a side deck. This is the data for how many copies of Maxx each of the 994 decks played. (89.24% of them played it at 3, 6.54% don't play the card at all, and the other around 4% is split between 1 and 2 copies. Here is the data for how many copies of Maxx players use as a bar chart, both as a number and as a percentage. To work out the chance of a player drawing Maxx, the average deck size of all these decks is also needed. Assuming everyone is on 40 cards when they are in fact not, the estimate of how often Maxx shows up will be skewed higher than the actual chance. Master Duel Meta has a statistic that shows the average deck size of each deck type on its site, so this information can be used to work out the average deck size across the data. There's 120 individual deck types here, from Snake Eyes to Sulphur Code, and there's a number of decks here that want to be at 60 cards like Branded, so it's important to look at this data. Taking the average size of each of these deck types, and then multiplying this by how often they appear, and then adding them all together will give the total number of cards in these decks. This can then be divided by the total number of decks to get an average deck size of 42.26 cards. Now obviously a deck can't have 0.26 of a card, so I'll round down to 42 and use that to calculate future statistics. Looking at the chance of a player drawing Maxi in their opening hand in a 42 card deck, the chance is 32.32% if you play 3 copies, 22.65% if you play 2 copies, and 11.9% if you only play 1 Maxi. When calculating the chance of someone opening Maxi in a duel, you need to look at each of the 10 configurations of how many copies of Maxi players can have in their deck. If one player doesn't play the card, the other player can be playing 0, 1, 2, or 3 copies. If one player plays 1 copy, the other player can have 1, 2, or 3 copies. The combination of one player having 0 and the other having 1 was included earlier, so there's no need to include it here also. If one player has 2 copies, the other could be on 2, or 3 copies. And finally, both players can be on 3 copies. For situations where both players have Maxi in the deck, I can do similar calculations to before when I looked at the chance of each player playing Maxi from the in-game data. For example, if both players play 3 Maxi, the chance for both players to draw the card is 10.45%. For situations where only one player has Maxi, you can simply note the chance of them drawing it, and then do 1 minus that chance, which is the chance of them not drawing it. The results of these calculations for 9 of the 10 configurations for how many Maxis are played can be seen here. And here is a chart with all that information at once. To work out the chance of there being no players on Maxi in a game, this requires the data gathered earlier from Messidor Meta. Using the chance of a player having 0 copies of Maxi in the deck and then squaring it, the chance of this happening is 0.428%, which is similar to the 0.31% calculated earlier from the in-game data. Similar calculations will have to be done for all the other combinations of Maxi, as all the data shows now is the chance of, say, one player drawing Maxi if both just so happen to be playing 2 copies, but not the chance of that happening if how many copies of Maxi each player have in their deck is based on the overall distribution of those 994 decks. Firstly, I need to calculate the chance that each of the 10 configurations of Maxi will show up, which can be done with similar calculations to what I have done in the past by using the usage data from the 994 decks. For example here, if both players have 3 Maxis, you square the chance that a player's deck will contain 3 copies of it to find out how likely that is. Then, this needs to be combined with the probabilities from earlier of players drawing Maxi if the 2 players in the duel have this configuration. For example here, combine the 79.63% chance that both players play 3 Maxi, with a 10.45% chance that both of the players in the duel draw Maxi if they both play 3 copies. This gives an 8.32% chance that if I were to look at a random ranked duel on the ladder, that this would be the situation that occurs. Here is the results for all the configurations. Unfortunately I can't really make this a bar chart because of the difference in magnitude there is between the chance of some of these situations occurring. Finally, adding all of the situations together where a player draws Maxi, or alternatively what I did, which is take away from 1 the situations where no one draws the card. This gives us the final answer that in approximately 50.71% of duels at Messidor, at least one player will open Maxi in their opening hand, meaning it's effectively a coin flip on whether a player will have Maxi every time you go into a ranked match, as long as it keeps seeing this much play. Obviously, Maxi will not always resolve every one of the games it's opened, because it can easily be countered by something like an Ash Blossom. So the next step is calculating the chance of a player drawing a counter to Maxi. Using the average 42 card deck that was decided earlier, this table shows the chance of a player going first or second drawing a counter to Maxi, depending on how many counters they run. Looking at the usual ratio of 6 Maxi counter cards, 3 Ash, 2 Called By, and a Crossout, a player will be able to stop the opponent's Ash Blossom over 50% of the time. But how many of these counters do people play on average? Looking at the decks from Messidor Meta again, the decks have these ratios for each of the counters. This can then be used to calculate the expected amounts of each card's index play, which is the mean, aka the average, number of copies for each of these cards. If you add these numbers together, you find the average number of Maxi counters run per deck. Unlike with the average deck count, I'm a bit unsure as to whether I should round this up or down. Duel and Gamma account for 1.13 of this average, and I don't know if I should count them here to begin with. But on the other hand, the play rate for each of these cards is slightly lower almost across the board compared to actual Master Duel, so if it were in-game you'd assume this average would be higher. As such, you'll look at the chance of both 5 and 6 counters to Maxi. Going back to the chance of a player drawing a counter to Maxi, people often mention having a counter is a coin flip, but it's actually slightly better than that if you play 6 counters, or if you play 5 and go second. Combining these chances with a previously calculated 50.71% chance that someone will open Maxi in a game, these are the chances that Maxi will resolve if it's used on someone playing that many counters. This means that the chance of Maxi being drawn and resolved in a duel is on average between 18.83% and 25.98%, meaning that it will happen around 1/5 to 1/4 of all ranked duels. If you have the chance that both players can have Maxi, or a player can have multiple, that chance is even higher, but that's a bit past the scope of this video. Notice these numbers aren't perfect. The player going first can have Maxi to use on the opponent's turn, also having already set up a Baron on board to negate the opponent's Maxi counter, but as this isn't something calculable, I think this is a decent estimate. Finally, if I want to find the true impact of Maxi, I'll have to work out how likely it is Maxi will win a game for you that you wouldn't have won otherwise without it. Now this is a rather impossible thing to calculate, as there's a bunch of factors that go into this. For example, people that play Stun or Flu aren't going to lose to Maxi. Or maybe the person using Maxi bricked, so they still lose if the opponent passes instead of taking the challenge. But I can get an estimate by looking at data from other people. During the Master Duel World Championship, Reddit user Prism Machete calculated the increase in win rate of a player both going first and second when they used Maxi. During Worlds, a player going first had their win rate increased by 11.1% when they used Maxi, and going second a player had their win rate increased by 8.6%. And obviously, this is a small sample size, it isn't data from this format, and the players at Worlds are a lot better than the randies you'll be playing against on ladder. But as this is the only way I can think to do this, I can at least use it to work something out. Combining this data with the chance Maxi has to resolve I calculated earlier, you can approximately find out how many games Maxi wins on its own. So looking at players whose opponent plays 6 Maxi counters, the chance that Maxi wins them the game if they go first is 2.09%, and if they go second it's 1.93%. For 5 Maxi counters, it's 2.49% going first, and 2.23% for going second. So the total win rate increase is 4.02% for 6 counters, and 4.73% for 5 counters. In the end, what this means is that Maxi wins between 1 in 20 and 1 in 25 of every single duel on ladder, just because it exists in the format. For interest, if you didn't play any counters for the card, you'd lose 10% of your games because of it. The overall data I've collected is specific to this format and the specific set of decks on Master Duel meta at the time when I looked. But looking at the overall data I've calculated here as an estimate, Maxi will show up in around 50.71% of all duels. Will resolve a bit less than half of those times, leading to it being active between around 1/5 to 1/4 of games, and will decide the duel on its own around 4% or 5% of the times it resolves, leading to the card single-handedly winning between 1 in every 20 or 25 duels on the ladder. Now, as I said at the start, this isn't a Maxi is bad video. Looking purely at the stats, I think we can all see that the card has quite a big impact on the game. Whether this is a bad thing or not is something for you to decide. Answering the question from the title of the video though, I'd say that unsurprisingly, Maxi is actually pretty goddamn good. Since I started editing the video, from some of the clips I used, I found out that the average number of cards played for Maxi and Ash is higher in Master Duel than for what I was using. Now, whether that means I found an over or underestimate, I have no idea. But what I've done is find a general estimate for the stats around Maxi, as it's impossible to calculate it exactly. So while I'll never get it to 100%, I think what I found is around the right range for the actual numbers. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. It's a rather math heavy one, so I have no idea if it's something anyone cares about, but hopefully the results were interesting at least. Also, thanks for the support on my last video. It's now my highest viewed one, when I only started on 20 views after 2 days, but then it suddenly shot up. I know the topic was controversial, so not everyone was convinced, and there was a lot I didn't go over, but it's good to see that a lot of people have the same mindset as I did. But yeah, this has been Jack100 signing off. Have a good day.